Welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, a channel dedicated to showing and discussing all manner of interesting music and films from my personal collection. On the agenda today, we have a couple of CD reissues of early albums by British electronic musician Mark Shreeve. And yeah, to say that this guy was a student of that classic run of 70s LPs coming out of Germany on labels like Ore and Brain would be a little bit too much like stating the bleeding obvious. But as I was re-listening to this one the other day, Embryo from 1980, it's more or less all I could think of. Though, as we'll get onto, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The first half, mostly comprising of the epic The Keeper, sees Shreeve channeling the moody magnificence of early period Tangerine Dream, teasing out short melodic motifs over brooding synth drones, before drifting off into all manner of other scenes and spaces over the course of its 27 minutes, from stately and almost medieval sounding to cold and glacial. Following the brief, waltzing palette cleanser Alive, we hit the album's other epic, the multi-part title suite. Here, Shreeve gets down to some heavy Klaus Schulze worship, letting loose with the sustained minor chord and noodly solo action, briefly breaking off into altogether more pastoral territory, before it's straight back to the deep space jamming. Then, to finish, we get the album's moodiest cut, the appropriately frigid Ice Flakes. This is also reminiscent of prime Schulze, with atonal twitterings and eerie UFO drones floating freely over Shreeve's morose synthscapes. On to 1981's Thoughts of War. Now, I read another review of this which said something along the lines of it's another record firmly in the tradition of the Berlin School, but it has just about enough unique qualities to stand on its own. And yeah, whilst it starts off still hovering about in the Schulze zone with the first part of the title track, Shreeve locked in combat with an especially persistent sequencer pattern. As things progress, he does eventually filter in a little bit of his own flavour. Take the next piece, Nightmare of Reality. Yeah, its doomy introductory synth riff wouldn't have been out of place on the soundtrack of one of Norman J. Warren's horror or sci-fi movies from around the same time, after which things go totally off-piste into atonal synth soundscaping. Always a welcome thing in my books. In the second half, Dream Sequence finds Shreeve adding subtle embellishments to a series of slow, simple arpeggios until things conclude with the other part of the title suite, which begins in a stark and sombre area with the aptly named Funeral in Desolation. The next part, Remembrance, cycles around a beautiful Baroque-style progression, after which he fires up the sequencer once again and sets the controls for the heart of the Schulze, getting down to some moodily Eastern soloing in the process. Ashes to Dust is the final movement, wrapping things up on an increasingly desolate note, the whole piece ripe with an atmosphere of Cold War misery. As I say, it seems like Shreeve's ultimate fantasy probably would have been to travel back in time 7 or 8 years and have these early efforts of his put out on vinyl by those aforementioned German labels. But in reality, most of them were confined to obscurity on the early 80s UK and European underground cassette network. As this video attests, these two titles at least were afforded CD reissues back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but even they're out of print and expensive nowadays. And with Shreeve's untimely death in 2022, mere months after Schulze's own passing, it seems unlikely that these enjoyable works will ever see a widespread reissue campaign. I do own one other CD of his, Assassin, originally from 1983. Now, I haven't listened to this in full in a while, but skimming through it on YouTube, I'm reminded that by this point, he'd moved into a more sort of energetic, neon cityscape synth pop direction, So not entirely my bag musically, but possibly with a touch more originality than his cosmic stuff. As for these two, instead of going completely crackers over Shreeve's blatant hero worship, I file them in the same category as the earliest work of Adalbert von Dayen. Yeah, basically, if you wish that the likes of TD, Edgar Froese, and or Schulze had just managed to squeeze out a few more LPs during their golden periods, then this stuff is pretty much the next best thing. So yeah, if you can get over the fact that there's a different name on the sleeve, then you're good to go. In fact, if you happen to know any Berlin school freaks, why not stick a bit of Embryo on next time they're around and see if they can tell the difference. Okay, so that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed this one and want more, feel free to check out the archive and hit subscribe to keep up to date with all future ramblings. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.